Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Kamal Gupta, and he just published a book May 10th, 2022. Title of the book is Play It Right, the remarkable story of a gambler who beat the odds on Wall Street. And there is an audio book of this. There's a hardcover and softcover. Kamal Gupta earned an undergraduate degree in electrical engineering from the Indian Institute of Technology in New Delhi, entering the elite institution after only completing the 11th grade, and he has received a master's in computer science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in just 11 months. Bored in the tech world, he turned himself into a professional blackjack player, and then an unexpected turn of events brought him to Wall Street, where for over 2 decades he beat the odds in every imaginable way. Kamal Gupta now lives in the greater New York City area with his family. And again, the book we're going to talk about today is Play It Right. So Kamal Gupta, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Awesome. So for people, maybe this is your first book. Can you kind of talk? You have a very interesting life and a great book. We were talking the pre-show, you really have a great sense of humor. But can you kind of talk about your background growing up in India and then what led you into these different curious careers? You've had quite an arc of in your life. So can you talk about that?
It is. I've had quite an unusual arc. I mean, I think I've had 4 different professions going back from author. Before that, I was a hedge fund manager on Wall Street. And before that, a professional blackjack player. And then it all started with being a computer scientist. But it all goes back to growing up in India. And I grew up in India in the 70s and in the early 80s, which was a very difficult time. It was pretty turbulent, period in Indian history. And those were my formative years. And I write in the book about my high school years as well as my college time at the Indian Institute of Technology in New Delhi. And the one thing that really affected me in those years was the fact that I found that people by and large around me, and from the lowest level to the highest level, abused their authority. And that I couldn't trust what was going on around me. And this is reflected in the harrowing set of events that take place in fall of 1984, which is also described in the book. But I think what I took away from my childhood was that I just had this inherent rebellious streak against authority and especially abuse of authority, and I couldn't stand to see unfairness of any kind. And India in those years, and maybe even today, was like filled with unfairness, and to a large extent, America today is as well. But in my life, I mean, whenever I encountered unfairness, I tried to deal with it in my own little way. And I came to America when I finished my undergraduate degree in electrical engineering, having completely lost all interest in the subject. So I came to the US to study computer science, which was a natural offshoot of electrical engineering, only to discover that I had no interest in computer science either. I mean, I worked in the computer industry for a few years, Honeywell in Minneapolis, Oracle in the Bay Area. But the whole time I was searching for something else to do. I couldn't imagine spending the rest of my life, sitting in a cubicle, punching on a keyboard all day long. I mean, I couldn't imagine anything more soul-crushing than that. And on a ski trip to Lake Tahoe, I discovered blackjack. I mean, I was there only to have dinner. I mean, I had no interest in gambling or casinos before then, because it was obvious to anyone watching the goings-on inside a casino that from the chandeliers down to the carpets, everything in a casino is paid for by the losses of the gamblers. Without those losses, those large buildings would not be standing. So, I mean, why am I going to play this game? Until I discovered that blackjack is the only casino game where by counting cards, you can turn the odds in your favor and against the houses. And even more importantly, I found out that the guy whose book I read, his name is Ken Houston, the book was called $1 Million Blackjack. He was not only thrown out of many casinos for having the audacity to use his brain while playing the game, he was also arrested and beaten on several occasions. And that, to me, was just wrong and unfair. And I decided that I was going to follow in his footsteps and become a professional blackjack player and teach the casinos a small lesson in my own little way. I mean, I knew I'm not going to change, the industry. But I was driven by the fact that the casinos don't offer a fair game to their clients. And, they essentially choose their customers. So if you can beat them, they'll throw you out. It's a fate that I suffered on many occasions. And
it's not very easy to count cards, is it? I mean, you became an expert and you had almost kind of like a spy versus spy approach to it. Can you talk about the kind of techniques and
it is.
the
It's
strategy that you had to pull it off?
Oh yeah, it's definitely a spy versus a spy because there is a game of blackjack, which is essentially pure math, right? I mean, but then there is another game within the game, which is how do you continue playing the game without getting kicked out if they were to identify you as a card counter, and which they certainly will. So first, I became an expert card counter by practicing for months and months, like 6 to 8 hours a day at home. And then it took another 6 or 8 months before I was able to consistently beat the casinos. And then I got thrown out a few times. So I had to take a lot of evasive measures so I didn't get kicked out again. I mean, starting with, playing with under fake names. And in the early 90s, the casinos would make you a card with any name you gave them. And then there was no ID check, nothing. So I just made up names. I took all my friends' first and last names and mixed and matched them so I would remember what the names were and used a separate name in every casino. I mean, I lowered my bet variation. I took on the persona of a plastics importer exporter from India who was just this wild and crazy guy. I mean, I started acting like a madman on the tables because I practiced card counting so much that I could count cards with just a glance. So I had a few seconds left over in every hand, which I used to just act like a nut job, which was an act to make the casinos think that if the guy is so animated, and so vociferous about whatever he's doing, he couldn't possibly be counting cards because it's well understood counting cards requires a lot of concentration. So I acted like a madman on the tables, and finally I started stealing my own chips from the table in order to make my stack smaller. So I became an expert in palming a chip because the eye in the sky is always watching you. So I became an expert in putting my hand on the table and palming my chips, or a chip at a time, and squirreling it away into my pocket. And slowly, by the end of the session, I mean, whether I'd won or lost, it would appear that I had won less than I'd won, or I would have lost more than I had really lost. So the casinos didn't realize how much I was winning, and those the chips that I squirreled away, I would cash them in small increments throughout the day. Sometimes I would take them back home to San Francisco and just keep cycling through the chips and use them as my bankroll. So I was forced
to take you had your Campari and soda you could take to the bathroom.
Oh, right. That's right.
So you had all kinds of techniques.
Yes, there was another. I'm glad you mentioned that because I had this drink called Campari and tonic, and I like the taste of the drink, but the real reason I ordered the drink was because Campari is a blood red liqueur, right? Like it's a blood red drink, and even when you mix it with tonic, it has a distinctive color. So while I was gambling, I would take the drink with me to the men's room, water it down such that the color sort of still stayed, but the alcohol was down to like minimal. So the casinos thought I was ordering drink after drink and apparently drinking it in front of them. They had no way of knowing that most of it was water. So I mean, it was like a show that I had to put on for the pit boss's benefit, just so I didn't get kicked out and I could continue playing. And it was, after a while, this cat and mouse game became fun as well. I mean, how do I play the game? So I beat the casinos consistently, and B, not get kicked out for counting cards.
Shifts. You would go early, take a break.
Exactly.
CPK,
I would wake up at 5 in the morning,
right,
because that's the quietest time of the day in the casinos. And I had gone to bed at 10 o'clock at night, so I've had like a solid 7 hours of sleep. And I would wake up and take a shower. I would go down to the floor feeling fresh as rain, but looking completely disheveled, so that the pit bosses and the dealers would think that I had been up all night gambling. And then they would leave me alone. Like, oh, this guy's he's just a loser who's been gambling all night. How could they have guessed that it's also an act to make it look like, just anything that I could do to just not pay attention to me. Or if they paid attention to me, and even if they found out that I was a card counter, they would think I was a loser. Whether it's because I was talking too much or I was, stealing chips from my table, whatever I could do to make them think that it was worth their while to let me keep playing.
And the mechanics of counting cards is there's 6 stacks in a holder, right? And you're counting plus and negative. you're trying to get that run of all face cards, right? And then you
Yes.
bet more at that time, right?
Yeah,
That's
and the counting system I use, like the most common counting system is called a plus one minus one system, where high cards have a plus one minus one value and low cards have a plus one value. But I used a really complicated system, which has which is called a plus three minus three system, and it allows, I mean, a much more finely tuned understanding of the state of the deck, because different cards have different values ranging. I mean, there's 7 different weights from plus three to minus three, and as a result, you have greater betting efficiency and also more the way you play the hand. Like sometimes you'll stand on a 16, and sometimes you'll hit on a 12 against a dealer 5 because of the state of the deck. And having an advanced counting system, well, on one hand, it's really hard to do it, but I just practiced like there's no tomorrow at home, and I became proficient at it. And that gave me an added advantage over the casino and allowed me to beat them with a lower bet variation. And as it
right.
turns out later on in the story, it also, that counting system was instrumental in my landing my Wall Street job.
Right. I mean, that was your end too to Lehman Brothers, right? Was your knowledge of counting cards? Isn't that true?
That's exactly right. I mean, it was, I had decided that the rest of my life, in late 1992, was going to be spent traveling the world playing blackjack. I knew I had gained almost a 1% advantage over the house, and that was enough to turn it into a living. And I had planned, that's what I had planned for the rest of my life. But then on a spur of the moment trip to Manhattan, I had some friends of friends, who were all employed on Wall Street. And I just happened to meet them in a nightclub, and they asked me, like, what do you do? And I couldn't answer what I should do other than accept that I'm a professional gambler. Because I couldn't call myself a computer scientist because I never had any interest in it. And electrical engineering was in the distant past. Wall Street, I could never imagine I would even end up here. So what else was I other than a professional gambler? But those two words, professional gambler, it's amazing the effect they have on people. And it stopped everyone in their tracks. They wanted to know all about my stories. I mean, a lot of which are in the book. And then at the end of the night, one of them said, like, you should work on Wall Street. I said, yeah, right. I mean, like, I didn't go to business school. I don't have a fancy Ivy League degree. I don't have a business background. And more importantly, I'd once taken a vow that I would never work on Wall Street or live in New York City, because New York City was in the 70s, in the 80s, was like a dark and dirty and depressing place. And Wall Street was, to me at least, from a distance, it seemed like a place populated by crooks. So why would I want to be involved with this place? But still, when I went back to San Francisco and I read Liar's Poker, and I realized that they have hired other gamblers in the past. So I decided to put a resume together and put blackjack on the top, computers and electrical engineering at the very bottom, hoping that nobody would notice it, and sent it to a few investment banks. And of those, Lehman and one other agreed to interview me. And Lehman asked me to fly down. I used my frequent flyer miles on what I thought was like a foolish pursuit. And I came down, and all day long, Lehman's traders grilled me on blackjack. Like, they asked me everything that they could think of about the game. But the problem is, like, blackjack had been my life for over 2 years, almost 2.5 years. I knew more about the game than all of my interrogators combined. And I just have had this natural brashness that I didn't hold back. And I just let them know it, that there's nothing you can ask me that's going to trip me up. And I conducted myself with not knowing that this is what's required in a Wall Street trader. I was brash, and I was obnoxious, and I was, aggressive, and they loved it. But at the end of that day, they said, okay, we want to make sure you're not just all talk. You told us a little while ago that you've counted a deck in as little as 15 seconds. And I had, and I wasn't lying. I could count a deck in 14 or 15 seconds at the peak of my powers. And they said, okay, here is a deck. We're going to take one card out of this deck. We'll give you 18 seconds, like a little more than what you think you need. And in those 18 seconds, let's see if you can figure out what the missing card is. Now, under normal circumstances, I should have been able to do that with like at least a 95% probability. But the problem is, I'm not at home. I'm not in a casino. I'm on a Wall Street trading floor, which is, it's the first time I've been in this strange environment, and a crowd has gathered to watch me do this, which was which made me really uncomfortable. Blackjack, it was a solitary pursuit. It's not a spectator sport. So at the same time, it was clear to me that my job prospects hinged on my performance on those 18 seconds. So I said, okay, fine, let's give it a shot. Someone puts 18 seconds on the clock, shouts, go. I pick up the deck, I rifle through it, as fast as I can and count the cards in clumps of 2 or 3. And 16 seconds later, I shouted, done. And of course, the next question is, okay, what's the card? And I got lucky here because the counting system that I used, which was +3, -3, there was a 50% probability that the card that they had picked out would have a unique value. So in this case, they had picked out a 9. So I said it's a 9, and 9 has a weight of -1 in my counting system, and it's the only card that has a weight of -1. So when I reached the end of the 51 cards and the weight was and the resulting number was +1, I knew the final card has to be -1 because the whole deck has to add up to 0. So I said it's a 9. The guy turns over, the card with a flourish, and it's a 9 of clubs. And I was like immensely relieved, and there was a crowd. There was a little bit of clapping, because it was quite a show, right? It was like a parlor trick someone had pulled off. And it sounds like, I don't know how many people have tried to do this, but try taking a card out of a deck and trying to identify what number it is in 15 or 20 seconds. It's extremely difficult to do.
It's hard to count cards too. Everybody thinks that they can become a card counter. But
it's very hard.
Yeah, it's hard.
Extremely hard. It took me 6 or more hours of practice every day for months on end before I was able to count cards at home. And then it took me several more months before I counted in a casino atmosphere, which is completely different, right? Because there's so many distractions. There's the slot machines, people squealing and, talking to you, asking you for advice. Waitresses tapping you on the shoulder every few minutes. There's a lounge singer belting out the audio. I mean, the whole place is filled with distractions, right? It's not like sitting at home and being able to concentrate. So how do you count cards amidst all this noise and commotion? And that was very difficult for me, even after having learned to count cards at home. So yeah, it's a very challenging exercise. And then counting on a trading floor was even harder, but right. I got lucky.
It's like going from one kind of bells and whistles all around to another one, because the environment of those investment banks, it's very competitive. It's almost like a frat house, like jokes and people screaming at each other. It's not like an accounting office or something, right?
Oh, not even remotely. It's a place where, I hate to say this, but people are rooting for you to fail. Because it's a competitive business. It's a zero-sum game. If someone else fails, it increases the probability of your success. So yeah, so that's how I ended up on Wall Street, by counting a deck of cards in 16 seconds on the Lehman Brothers trading floor. And soon thereafter, I was taken into an office and handed an envelope which had a job offer. I to this date, even though it was almost 30 years ago, 29 and change years ago, I still remember the shock that I received when I opened that envelope and it said, "We are pleased to offer you a position as a junior trader at Lehman Brothers, ... I didn't even read anything beyond that, And I couldn't believe it. It's so difficult to get hired in this industry, and all I had, to me, it seemed like all I had done was, played blackjack for a couple of years, but that was enough for them. And they decided to take a chance on a blackjack player. And so I got up, moved lock, stock, and barrel from San Francisco to New York.
Right. And so you went in there right at the 90s and got involved.
93. Yeah.
93. That was kind of got involved in mortgage
yes.
securities, right? Can you talk about that? What your position was like and what was like adapting to that environment?
It was really difficult. As luck would have it, even though I'd never heard the word mortgages before, I ended up in the mortgage-backed securities market, And, some parts of that market would be blamed for the financial crisis, 15 years later. But in the very early 90s, in 1993, I showed up not knowing the first thing about finance, like literally nothing. I had never read a book, never opened Wall Street Journal, couldn't tell you the difference between a stock and a bond on that day. And it took no time. Maybe it took an hour for me to be exposed as a know nothing. And as a result, I was only given the most menial of jobs on the trading floor. Like, I made copies, I answered phones, I faxed. This is when faxing was still a thing. I faxed reports to clients. The funny thing is, my most important job during those first few months was fetching food for these masters of the universe. Like, because their time was so valuable, they couldn't be bothered to go down to the cafeteria and pick up food for themselves. So I would take everyone's order, and I would go down to the cafeteria and get food for everyone. Because that's all I was good for initially, because my time was the least valuable on the trading desk. Because I didn't know anything. I mean, fortunately, within 3 or 4 months, I sort of learned enough to show that my time had some value and it should be spent better. It was better spent on the desk. So they picked another flunky, on the desk and said, okay, from now on, you're going to get food and take his order as well. So in a flash, I went from being a waiter to being waited upon.
And can you describe what it's like in those investment firms? Because there's like a front end, back end, the
Yes.
support.
Yeah, I write about this in the book. And it's funny, like, I don't think anyone thinks of it like this, but investment banks, especially the trading floor particularly, it functions very much like a British manor house. Like, if you've watched Downton Abbey or Upstairs, Downstairs, the aristocrats live on the upper level, and the cooks and maids and all the service staff on the lower level. And the upper level, the aristocrats of Wall Street or of a trading floor, are its salespeople and especially the traders, because they are the front office of the establishment, and they're client facing, and they're responsible for generating the lion's share of the firm's profits. The back office, on the other hand, again, akin to the cooks and maids of Wall Street. They sit in the back, in the shadows. They check out every trade, compute the nightly profit and loss statements, compile position sheets. They're essentially the clerks of Wall Street. But the edifice would crumble if they didn't do the job properly. And their jobs are essentially to make sure the front office functions smoothly. So as a result, the traders and salespeople of the front office lord over the cooks and maids of the back office, the clerks, the people who check out your position reports and trades and profit and loss statements. And there's a dramatic difference in personality between the two sides. I mean, traders tend to be very brash and obnoxious and loud, whereas I don't think I've ever heard a back office personnel ever raise their voice. They wouldn't dare, even though they're floating around the trading floor all the time. So it's
just a lot of people don't know how those places function, and how much money is involved. Like, you talk about, you're involved in deals, millions and millions of dollars, global,
hundreds of millions of dollars. Yeah.
Right.
It's well, that's what it is, right? There is this sense of self-importance that goes with transacting. Like, every bond trader ends up transacting in deals worth, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, certainly tens of millions of dollars on basically a daily basis. It becomes part of life. I mean, and the only way to do this is to dissociate yourself from the denomination of the chip. And just like, a green chip or a black chip in a casino is a $25 chip and a $100 chip, and you can't really think about the money when you're playing the game. Just like this, you can't think about the amount of money that is involved. It's just the way of this world, and you just close your eyes and remove 6 zeros from every number and just deal with it.
Right, but also you don't think about the consequences of the investment for the so-called investor too.
Yes, that is very true. I mean, and I do talk about this to some extent, and through the various deals that I structured and what I witnessed myself in the 7 years I worked at investment banks before spending 2 decades, working for hedge funds. The atmosphere at an investment bank is not only abusive to its junior employees, it's extremely rapacious towards its clients. And I'm not sure how many clients realize this. Wall Street trading desks view the business as a zero-sum game, just like casinos view blackjack or slot machines as a zero-sum game. A player's loss in a Las Vegas casino is the house's gain. Similarly, a client's loss on any transaction is a trader's gain. And a trader's gain translates into his year-end bonus. So there's a direct relationship between, if you can rip the client off. And by the way, I've seen on numerous occasions heads of trading desks stand up in the morning at 8:30 and rip their hands and look around and say, okay, who are we going to rip off today? I mean, that is the attitude. And it's it's a culture that people come into when they're out of undergrad, and when they're 22 odd years old, and maybe they become part of it. But I had lived a life before I came to Wall Street. I'd come from India. I'd migrated to America, gotten a degree in computer science, worked in the computer industry. As much as I hated it, the culture was very different in the computer industry. I'd been a professional blackjack player, so I had done all these things. So my perspective on Wall Street was very different. I had come here to play a game and to play it or to play it right. And I had no interest in becoming an expert in deceiving gullible clients. So I just had a very difficult time in my early years in dealing with the two things, like how I was abused and then how clients were abused. And the clients don't know this, but I'm on the other side of the fence and I'm watching this on nearly a daily basis. And after 2 years of this, I couldn't take it anymore. And I wasn't sure I wanted to continue in this business. And I'm the only Wall Street trader who walked away from the business for 3.5 months, for a little over 100 days, not knowing if I was going to come back. And Lehman was furious with me, my bosses. They had invested 2 years in me, and here I am just walking out of the place. And they made it very clear to me that there might not be a job for me when I come back. And I said, that's fine. I'm leaving because I need to get my sanity. Because 2 years in Wall Street was probably those first 2 years, early '93 to early '95, was the roughest period of my life. And I just had enough. And I said, I need to walk away from this for some period of time to do two things. First, to gain some perspective on what is it that I'm doing, and B, to figure out if I should even continue. And it was probably, in hindsight, it turned out to be the most pivotal 100 days in my life, because as it turned out, I was also getting married at the time. That's a side note. But in those 3.5 months, I figured out why I had come to Wall Street. And I'd sort of forgotten that over the last 2 years, even though I knew when I showed up in early '93. I'd come here to play a game and beat the market, just like I had played blackjack to beat the casinos. So I said, okay, I'm going to go back to Wall Street. I do go back, otherwise there wouldn't be a Wall Street book. And I was going to spend all my time on devising a strategy to beat the US mortgage market on a consistent basis, day in and day out, month in and month out. And I would either figure out the strategy, or I would just leave the business. Because there was nothing else. I was not willing to be part of an investment bank system where I would get paid large amounts of money because I was great at fleecing clients. That's a skill I had no interest in picking up. I wanted to learn how to play this game.
And so what did you do? What steps did you take to kind of, you said, right, I think in your book, 103 consecutive months of positive returns.
Right. So that's where I eventually ended up. Actually, it's becoming really dark out here. Do you mind if I turn the light on?
No, sure, no problem.
Is that okay? Because it's it's in New York. It's become really dark at the moment.
No problem.
So,
no problem. But I think what he did was switch from investment banking to hedge funds, right? I think you ran, if I remember correctly, you ran a hedge fund. Can you explain how hedge funds function too? Can you explain how hedge funds function?
See, the funny thing about hedge funds is, and I'm happy to go through this, but the irony is most hedge funds do not hedge. The idea behind the word hedge means that you have some offsetting trade against the primary trade that you have, in case you turned out to be wrong. For instance, if you believe the stock market is going to go up and you buy Google stock, that's just a naked bet on the price of Google stock, right? However, if you were to short S&P 500 against it, now suddenly you're kind of hedged against large market moves in one direction to other. You're still exposed to the relationship between Google and S&P 500, but you're not exposed to large-scale market moves up or down, because presumably Google and S&P 500 have some relationship by which they move. That's what hedge funds are supposed to do, but that's not what they do. In my experience, and I watched this in my sell side years when I worked at investment banks from 93 to 99, many hedge funds, and the biggest blow up of that was long term capital, blew up because they hedge funds deploy leverage. So for every $1 that a hedge fund has, they might borrow $10 more to buy $11 worth of assets. But long-term capital took it to a whole other, extent and started borrowing 25, 30, $40 for every dollar that they had. And the problem with this leverage that hedge funds are unique in the sense that they use leverage. They borrow money to buy more assets than they can really afford to buy. So a $100 million hedge fund can easily buy $1 billion worth of assets by borrowing 900 million. And there's a finely tuned Wall Street infrastructure that allows them to borrow this money. The advantage of borrowing money is that it amplifies your return by a factor of 10 when you've borrowed 9 times as much. But at the same time, it reduces the margin of error by a factor of 10. If you owned $100 worth of stock with $100 worth of capital, only a complete wipeout can make you bankrupt. However, if you own $1 billion worth of stocks or bonds against $100 million worth of capital, a mere 10% drop in the market will wipe you out. So that's what makes hedge funds particularly dangerous. And which is why, even though I worked in the hedge fund industry for more than 2 decades, I employed a very conservative approach because all the hedge funds that I'd seen blow up in front of me in 94, 98, and beyond, and the market is littered with the bodies of hedge funds that borrowed too much and invested in a strategy that went awry. And by and large, the strategy that went awry is called a carry trade, where you buy a higher yielding asset and hope to finance it at a lower rate and just collect free money. But contrary to popular belief, these carry trades blew up long-term capital in 1998, and they blew up all of Wall Street and almost the entire world in 2008.
Right. And can you talk about what led up to 2008? I mean, it was an incredible time to be alive in the financial world because
It
everything came to a
was.
halt. Yeah, amazing.
It was, and it was, to me, I had spent 7 years formulating an investment method that was supposed to be independent of the macroeconomic environment, whether the housing market was in a bubble or a crash. I was supposed to come out ahead no matter what. So I was truly hedged. So that's why I call myself, a proper hedge fund. But that was not the case with the world at large, and including some of the large firms like a large Swiss bank where I was employed from 99 to 05. And when I discovered what was going on, I was like horrified because it was clear to me as early as fall of 2004 that these things called CDOs and subprime mortgages were extraordinarily dangerous things. Now, at the time in late 04, I felt the problem was confined to this one Swiss bank where I was employed. I could never have imagined that it was pervasive and spread throughout the financial industry, which took me a few more years to figure out. But I was so freaked out by CDOs and subprime mortgages in fall of 2004 that even though I was very happy at my job, I got up and left. And in early 2005, I went to work for a no-name British hedge fund that was not invested in credit products like CDOs and subprime in any fashion. And they didn't even have an office in America. Few people in America had even heard of them. Eventually, they grew to become the largest hedge fund in Europe, like a few years later. But when I agreed to join them in late 04, early 05, they were only 2 or 3 years old. And people were shocked. I had abandoned this huge, prestigious Swiss bank to work for a complete no-name British hedge fund. But in hindsight, it was the most brilliant move of my life, because the actions taken by the Swiss bank in terms of just loading up the balance sheet with risky assets like CDOs and subprime are the two of the biggest examples, would cause an unfathomable blow up at this firm and, of course, the rest of the world as well in 2008, where this company would lose, I think, something like $40 billion in write-downs on their positions, and their market value would drop by an astonishing $100 billion. And if it wasn't for the Federal Reserve and the Swiss governments bailing them out, not just this Swiss bank, virtually every bank, every investment bank would have ceased to exist.
Right. There was, I think Bernanke dropped 25 trillion just printed money up and
Right after
tried to
that,
set everything up.
yes.
Yeah, incredible.
Yeah,
I mean, these are incredible sums.
and these trillions that the I mean, obviously the money was just given to these banks in '08, in the bailout. But even subsequently, the Federal Reserve has indulged in this large-scale quantitative easing. I mean, they're taking it away right now, but it's kind of closing the barn door after the horse is already bolted. But for 10, 15 years, from 2008 till late 2021, the Federal Reserve was involved in a quantitative easing of some kind where they just printed money left, right, and center. Now, on the surface, they say, well, it's to help the economy and, and the individual or sustain employment and all that stuff. But I don't believe any of it. I believe that the Federal Reserve is captured by the stock S&P 500. And every time the stock market crashes and or has a cold, the Federal Reserve takes corrective action. When the flip happens and stock market goes haywire, they don't do anything. Right. And I don't talk about this in the book, but I wrote op-ed piece that I mentioned this fact. Ben Bernanke, right, was the Federal Reserve for years, printed trillions of dollars. His salary at the Fed was roughly $200,000 a year.
Right nothing after for the amount of money that he controls. It's nothing.
Right after he leaves the Federal Reserve, he takes part in a string of dinners where in one evening he is paid $250,000 a night. One evening. Now, how many people can afford to pay that for an audience with the ex-Federal Reserve chairman? Only the rich people, rich investment banks, financiers, investors, just very wealthy people.
Janet Yellen doing the same thing today.
Exactly. And Janet Yellen, she stopped being the the federal chairman in 2018, or 19, and became the Treasury Secretary in 2021. In 1920, in those 2 years, she collected over $7 million in speaking fees. Right. Citigroup paid her $1 million. I mean, you really have to ask, what is this money for? And actually, the ultimate proof of this lies in the payments made to Hillary Clinton by Goldman Sachs and all these other major financial institutions. Before 2016, before that election, I think Hillary Clinton used to command something like $300,000 or $400,000 for a speech. After the election, that number went down to $25,000 by a factor of 10. Now I ask you why? Has she suddenly become a less interesting person to talk to? Or is it the fact that she will never be president again?
The latter.
So in my mind, these speaking fees are nothing but legalized form of bribery.
I think you're right.
So the question is, when Federal Reserve Chairman is collecting $200,000 a year as the Fed Reserve Chairman, but can look forward to a $250,000 payday every night, who are they really serving while they're in office?
Wall Street.
Well, yeah, I mean, not the common man, because it's the stock market, right? It's people invested in the stock market, which is largely the rich and the powerful. And, the interests of the common man, I think, are, maybe now the Fed is coming around to thinking about this. But, if you think about it, inflation has gone up lately. And one of the drivers of that is, there's labor shortage. So wages are going up. And it's astonishing to me how the Fed is so quick to take action when wages go up. And yet, when there was massive asset inflation in stocks and bonds, that was not a problem.
Right.
Because stocks and bonds are owned largely by rich people.
Right. The plunge protection team is what they call it. They
That's
set
right.
something and think so that if the stock market goes down, liquidity goes into the market. So
well, it started in 1996. Back when, I don't know if you recall, that was the last time I remember any Fed chairman talking negatively about the stock market, because Alan Greenspan came out and used this famous term, irrational exuberance. And he got slammed for it, such that he went from talking about the irrational exuberance of the stock market to the Greenspan put, where every time the market goes down, Greenspan's there to bail it out. So, I don't remember a single time since then where a Fed chairman has said, well, the stock market might be frothy or maybe too high.
Right.
Doesn't happen. Somehow they've cast their lot. And the niftiest trick that Wall Street has pulled is to equate the economy, the Main Street economy, with stocks. In reality, the two have very little to do with each other. Yes, there's a trickle-down effect, but that's been debunked. I think there's a lot of evidence to debunk that. But Main Street and Wall Street have completely different objectives and different agendas. And to conflate the two of them with each other is like a huge mistake. And yet that's what's been done for at least a quarter century.
And look at this whole mortgage meltdown. A lot of these banks were made whole, but the average guy on the street with his house, they had to lose their house or whatever. Yeah, so
they were repossessed. And
really
this is what really infuriates me, because about the bailouts is every investment bank got something like 25 billion or more. I think AIG got 100 some billion, some insane amount of money. Why couldn't you give every homeowner $10,000, $20,000? It's an infinitesimal small amount of money. But that was considered a moral hazard. Like giving $10,000 or $20,000 to a homeowner would create a moral hazard. But giving 25 to 50 billion to an investment bank, well, that's fine, because that's a systemic risk.
It was very strange. The whole 2008 and who got the money to, because like Washington Mutual went away, Lehman Brothers no longer exists, right? Bear Stearns, but some of these other ones did. So it was really something else. But the rich stayed rich, that's for sure.
Well, that's that's where not just the Federal Reserve, by the way, I would take it even a step further and say the entire US establishment, from the government to the Supreme Court to, obviously the Federal Reserve, even the universities, like everything, I think it's this income inequality. If you just take Harvard, for example, arguably the most prestigious of US universities, their endowment is a direct reflection of increased inequality in America. And because I wrote this in the op-ed where I said, once you've bought all the material goods that your heart desires, you might as well shoot for immortality by buying a hospital wing or a museum at a university or a school somewhere, something like that. And, if, and I have no sympathy for all these charitable foundations that all these billionaires have set up, because if you really had this charitable attitude, then maybe during the 80s and 90s, you should have allowed more competition for Microsoft. You should have charged less for your products, or just be a raider and say, you know what, I want to make as much money as I want, and that's it. It's fine. It's capitalism. You're allowed to do that, but don't then turn around and be this benevolent, charitable human being that's suddenly discovered that, you know what, I want to help people. Well, where were you 25 years ago?
Right. After you've accrued all this money.
Exactly. After you've raped and pillaged the population, and this is not necessarily true for every billionaire, because some of them have actually added a lot of value, but a lot of them have become supremely wealthy by controlling the political process, if nothing else, and by eliminating competition. This whole mergers and acquisitions that has gone on in America is insane, and it's a little known statistic that I like to quote, which is that in 1996 there were over 8,000 publicly listed companies in America. Today, there are only 4,000. Like, what kind of growth is that? The GDP has grown by a factor of 2, if not more, maybe 3 or 4 in this time. And the number of companies has shrunk by half. It's all through mergers and it's not that innovation has gone away. It's through mergers and consolidation. How many airlines do we have? How many options for cable TV do you have in your town? You'll be lucky to have 2.
Yeah, 2.
Yeah. Right. Why? Why do Verizon and Cox not compete with each other?
Right. So you just have corporate consolidation that's incredible. Like,
right. And exactly. They need to use antitrust to break up, social media companies, financial corporations, which are much bigger today than they were in 2008. So, next time they're guaranteed to get bailed out if they got bailed out in 2008.
Right. That's what the precedent of the 2008 bailout is.
Right. And in my opinion, I think that's the root cause of, I really believe, and this, as an immigrant, I was amazed when I came to America in the 80s that by the fact that anyone who wanted to work hard could attain a decent standard of living. All you needed was a desire and the ability to work hard. Doesn't matter what you were doing, right? And that's what made America special to me. But 25 years of playing it wrong has brought us to a point where there is no longer true in this country. And that's why we have all the strife and the division. So I believe the problems being faced by America today, could have been foretold. And I think it's greed and, that has a lot to do with it. And I'm not sure how you come back from here, but my contribution to the problem is writing a book which shows there is an alternative way to even function in a place as rapacious and as cutthroat as Wall Street. You can follow your own path. You can devise a method. You can. It's possible. It's okay to not be too greedy either. I mean, to try and focus on the game, not so much just the money that you can make by hook or crook. And I really believe if people were to focus on playing the game well to the best of their ability, they would not only end up with money, you know, they would also be able to sleep well at night, because that's what happiness means to me: playing the game well during the day, sleeping well at night.
Right, and you argue that there is such a thing as enough money, right? There is.
There is, and I strongly believe that beyond a certain point, happiness is not only not correlated with money, it could be inversely correlated with money. I've known some incredibly wealthy people in my life, during my quarter century on Wall Street. And I can tell you categorically, beyond a certain point, money does not buy you happiness. If anything, it can buy you more troubles. And so you have to find that happy medium. The irony is, when I started working in the computer industry and I was getting paid $37,000 a year, I really felt wealthy beyond my wildest dreams. And, people make seven figures on Wall Street and feel like they're poor because the guy next to them is making a little bit more than them. And it's just the whole relative, performance is what sort of led to the crisis as well, because everyone wanted to make more money than everyone else. And Chuck Prince, the CEO of Citigroup, even said this, like, oh, we must dance while the music is going on. And one day this will all be a problem. But for now, the music is playing. Well, the next year, the music stopped. And so I think I'm trying to impress through this book, apart from just telling an interesting story, is that it is possible to play the game well and still win, and play it right, not just from a method standpoint, but also from a moral standpoint.
Perfect. That's a great way to end it. Really a great book, great sense of humor too. Your stories are really fascinating. I've laughed along reading the book, but I also learned a lot. You have that inside perspective, so I highly recommend people play it right. And there is an audio book, correct?
There is. It's narrated by Fajer Al-Kasi, who has a great voice. For a while, I thought about narrating it myself, but I found it difficult. So they found a great narrator.
So you can get that. There's also a hardcover version, right? And then
there is a hardcover. There is an ebook. It's available on Kindle. It's available, everywhere books are sold. I mean, I know it costs more than the Kindle version, but I would strongly recommend the hardcover because the book is beautifully produced. I've obviously read the book on both mediums 100 times, if not more, and I think it's a much more pleasurable experience to read it as a physical book. Just the paper, the print, the ink makes for a much more, for the lack of a better word, sensuous experience.
Right. And there's a lot more left in the story, a lot more in your book. I mean, you worked in Wall Street to 2019, so the market crash. And I highly recommend people check this out. And if people want to reach out to you, Kamal, where's the best place to do that?
I have a website, which is a shameless copy of Michael Lewis's website. His website is michaellewiswrites.com. So my website is kamalguptawrites.com, as in WRITES. I recently signed on to Twitter because my publisher in India, which is Bloomsbury, wanted me to have a Twitter handle in the press release, which came out 3 days ago. And the book will be released the book is available now in North America and the UK. And it will be released in India on June 18th under the same title, but slightly different subtitle and a different cover and a different publisher. But it's 99.9% the same book. And so I have a Twitter handle called Kamal Writes.
Kamal Writes. So you can look on that. I'll put those links in the show notes so people can click through, check out your website. But congratulations on your first book. Keep writing. Really an excellent book.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to try. I'm working on book 2. We'll see.
Oh, good. Congratulations. Title of this one again is Play It Right, The Remarkable Story of a Gambler Who Beat the Odds on Wall Street, published May 10th, 2022 by Kamal Gupta. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right, stay there.